When Unreal Engine 5 released a couple of years ago, one of the major features was Lumen. We can change lights, materials, and objects in real time and see how things change without wait. Before that, we used to pre-calculate light, a process known as baked lighting. When you place a light, you will not see the effects or the true effects of that light until we click on baked light, and that process used to take from few minutes to few hours to even few days. Compared to Lumen, you will see everything happens in real time. Lumen is amazing because it removes the technical barrier. The light bake process was not very easy, it takes some learning, but with Lumen, things just work. So if you're an artist and you decide to use Lumen, you will have much easier time lighting your projects and seeing things react in real time to your light changes. Lumen is great, but it comes with some performance drawbacks, and with Unreal Engine 5.5, thanks to Mega Lights, now we can place hundreds of lights and the performance will still be good. It has a way to go compared to baked lighting. When we bake the lights we place have no performance impact once light is calculated. Today we will look at how we can use Lumen to light our projects. I hope you enjoyed today's lesson, and let's get started. So when it comes to lighting your projects, a good idea is to check your project settings. So if you know the project settings, you can skip this part, but if you don't know what are the project settings, you can keep watching. To access the lighting and rendering project settings, we need to go to Edit, and then we need to go to Project Settings. You can keep this menu here or you can duck it here, but for now I place it here so we can see better what's happening. And I also switch from normal LED mode to detail lighting so we can just see the lights without the materials. Now I will go to Engine, then I will go to Rendering. Under here you may have all these panels open. I personally like to close to see better what I'm working with, and you want to go to Global Illumination. Right now we are using Lumen, but if you want to bake your lights, you can switch this to none. Actually, you should switch it to none. And to bake the lights after, you go to Build and Build Lighting Only. Now, I will switch this to Screen Space just to show you, and I don't recommend using Screen Space. If you download plugins from NVIDIA, for example, you can find them here as well. So there are custom solutions for GI and reflections that you can use as well. So Lumen is what we're gonna use today. In terms of reflections, we also are using Lumen. So if you switch reflections to none, we're not gonna see any reflections, obviously. And if you switch it to Screen Space, you will have slightly better reflections. So let's go inside here, for example, and look at the windows here. So right now we're using Screen Space. If you switch this to Lumen, you're gonna have better reflections. But let's switch this to LED so we can see better what's happening. You can see the main difference between Lumen and Screen Space. So Screen Space will only reflect what's on the screen. In this case, there is not much to reflect. We can see here these, for example. If I obscure them from the view, you will notice that they will be gone. But if we switch back to Lumen, you will see the reflections just like they are intended. Under Lumen here, we have settings regarding the reflections and Lumen in general. So use hardware ray tracing when available. Right now I'm using this, but if I disable it, you're gonna see slight quality loss because it will fall back to software ray tracing. And under software ray tracing, we have two modes. We have detail tracing and we have global tracing. This one is higher quality than this one. However, it's slightly more heavy on performance. So if I switch to global tracing, and let's see from here, switch between global tracing and detail tracing, perhaps we can find another reflective surface. Let's take a look here. So detail tracing, global tracing, it works. So detail tracing will reflect better. Global tracing will reflect worse, but it's better for performance. And if we switch to use hardware ray tracing, this will give us the best reflections possible. It has two modes, hit lighting for reflections or use surface cache. This is the best for performance. However, it's not very good for the quality of the reflections. Surface cache will use the mesh distance fields to show us what's happening. So if I go back here and maybe let's switch the light again and take a look at the meshes here. If you switch this to hit lighting for reflections, it's going to use the actual mesh. And if we use surface cache, it's going to get slightly worse and we're going to see generally less quality reflections. If you want to see mesh distance fields in action, you can go to Show and you can go to Visualize, then find mesh distance fields from here. This is what Unreal Engine sees, and it also generates this when you open the project for the first time. And you can change this setting globally, or you can change it based on the mesh. Now, you can detach your meshes into multiple parts for higher quality, or you can edit it as we mentioned. So if you search for mesh distance, you're gonna see under software ray tracing, we have generate mesh distance fields. And if we go back to rendering, so let's close this and let's scroll to here, software ray tracing. We can change the voxel density. Right now it's using 0.2. So the lower this number is, the higher the mesh distance fields will be, the better the resolution and quality will be. But this also can be very heavy on the performance. So we can keep it as it is. Let's disable the view. So I go to Show, go to Visualize, and I will disable this. In addition to software ray tracing, we also have settings for hardware ray tracing. So if this is enabled or not enabled, you want to enable it, then restart the engine. It will take some time, but once you do that, you can easily enable it or disable it based on the preference you have. Right now here, it's using ray trace shadows. If I disable this, it will fall back to virtual shadow maps. And you can also switch this. However, I don't recommend that. Just keep the settings as they are. Just if you want to see between shadow maps and virtual shadow maps, that's the difference. These settings can also be accessed from the post-process volume. So if you have a post-process volume, or if you add one to your project, you can click on it, and let's expand the details panel. Go to global illumination and reflections. So right now it's using Lumen, and under reflections, it's also using Lumen. If you want to switch this to none, just like we did earlier from here, you can also do that from here. So these settings are accessible from here and from your post-process volumes. If you're going to use hardware ray tracing, just make sure that we have the default RHI is set to 12. So under platforms, Windows, if you are on Windows, this should be on DirectX 12. Now, if you go back to the rendering settings to recap, let's go all the way down. Global illumination, Lumen, reflections, Lumen. We're using hardware ray tracing. I will switch surface cache to heat lighting for reflections. And just because I want to have the best settings, I will switch this to detail tracing, but this will not affect us as long as we are using hardware ray tracing. However, if you're using software ray tracing, you can use detail tracing to get more photorealism of your scenes. In terms of shadows, you can use ray trace shadows. These can cause some issues with nanite meshes. So if you want to enable nanite across your project, the easiest way is to simply disable this and use virtual shadow maps. If you don't want to use nanite, you can use ray trace shadows and you should be good. But if you're going to import assets from other projects, they will have nanite and it's a big mess, to be honest. So virtual shadow maps are really good. So I'm gonna disable this and keep using virtual shadow maps for now. That's it for the settings. So I will see you next. So let's talk about lights. Right now I have a folder called Global Lights. We have a few actors here that I'm going to click and delete, so no spoiler alerts. When it comes to lighting your project, there will be two parts. There is the base light where you have your sun, your sky, and then you have your artificial lights where you place your interior lights or any light source that can be a lamp or anything. To view the type of lights we have in Unreal, we can go to the create menu and we can go to lights. You're gonna see we have a directional light, point light, spotlight, rectangular light, skylight. You may or may not have HDRI backdrop and sun and sky. To add these, we need to go to edit, plugins, and here you can search for HDRI, backdrop, enable this, and you can search for sun position calculator, which is the sun and sky, enable this, restart your engine. So if I disable this, it will tell me, hey, do you want to restart? Well, I don't want to restart, but if this is disabled, enable it, restart, and you will have these two other light sources. If you know you're going to place too many lights and you don't want to click here every single time and search for your lights, what you can do is go to window and you can open the panel place actors. This is what you used to have in Unreal Engine 4. It's beautiful panel. You can click on dock to sidebar if you want it now every now and then. So that's very cool. I will click here to keep it on top, and let's talk about our lights. A directional light will act as our sun. It will emit light from a source that is infinitely far away, just like the sun. So if you hold Alt and Control, you will learn more about each of these lights. So let's add directional light. When we add a directional light, our scene will almost come to life. Now we can see something, and you have the lighting settings here under the details panel. The intensity, when you add any directional light, it has the intensity of 10 lux, but if you want to simulate real world sun, you need to increase this to 75,000 and more. However, for the simplicity of things, we're gonna keep things at their default. All lights have shared settings. We have intensity, light color, temperature, effect world, cast shadows, and these settings. So to set up our base light, before we talk about the settings, we need a couple of actors. We need the directional light, we need skylight, and two more. Before I do that, let's first move our directional light to its folder. I will right click, move to. You can create a new folder or you can select a folder. In my case, I already have one. So let's click on that folder, right click, and make it our current folder. Right now, we don't have a sky. And to add the sky, we should go to visual effects and we will find sky atmosphere. So click add this, and now we have a sky. If you press on Ctrl L to change the direction of the sun, so first look at the light here, you can obviously change the rotation from here. But an easier way to do so is by pressing Ctrl L. We will have this actor here, and now when I'm moving my mouse left and right, the light or the sun is going around. And if I move my mouse up and down, it will also move up and down. So a mix of both will help you place your light or the sun easily. Right now, all our dark areas are really, really dark. And to fix this, we need the skylight. So notice when I go back to my light and when I add my skylight that these areas here will come to life based on the skylight we have here. So a skylight, if you press Ctrl Alt, the skylight captures the distant part of our level, everything further than the sky distance threshold. So the sky distance threshold is here. We usually keep this at default. Just so you know, you can change this to change how the skylight acts. We will go through these settings step by step, but first let's start with the directional light. In addition to these three actors, let me just quickly hide Cesium terrain. You can notice that the lower hemisphere is now completely dark, and that can be fixed or solved by adding an exponential height fog. So we can go back again to the visual effects and we click and drag exponential height fog, and this will take care of the lower hemisphere. Now, before we call it a day, we also need a post-process volume, and that would be our base light setup. So let's search here for a post-process volume. Simply type post and you're gonna see post-process volume. Click and drag, and right now we have 5 actors, and this is our base light setup for your exterior projects, for your interior projects. Technically, that's all you need. The post-process volume will take care of rendering settings, exposure settings, and so on, and especially the lens flare that can be a little annoying sometimes. So by adding a post-process volume and going to lens flares, intensity, let's set this to 0, you will notice nothing changed. That's because we also need to either make our post-process volume big enough to cover the area where we want the effect, or make it a global post-process. So if we scroll all the way down, you can see here infinite extent unbound. If you enable this, now our post-process volume is affecting our scene. One thing I like to do is taking advantage of the favorites. So if you click here on toggle favorites, right now I have no favorites. This is the new Unreal installation. But if I'm tired of always going and searching for my settings, you can click any setting you want and add that to your favorites, just like this. So now, every time I want to add a post-process volume and make it affect my world, we're gonna see under favorites, I have this setting here. And the same goes for all other actors. You can have favorites and add any setting you want. One other thing I like to add to my favorites is the exposure settings. So let me delete just one of these. keep 1. If you go to exposure, you're gonna see we have the exposure settings here, metering mode, exposure compensation. I will add both. So add this to my favorites, add this to my favorites. And maybe sometimes you don't want for auto exposure to happen. So just like real life, if you go to an interior place from a very bright area, our eyes will take time to adjust the exposure, like so. Now it's completely dark, but if you go up or go like this, you're gonna see it's very bright, and then it will slowly reduce the brightness. If you don't want this, you can set this to manual exposure, and then you can change the exposure compensation to a value that you like. So I keep this now to auto exposure as it is, and I will reset this to the value it is, which is 1. And let's talk more about our directional light. When you click on your directional light, as we discussed earlier, we have the intensity and the light color, which is pretty self-explanatory. Now we have source angle and source soft angle. If you want bigger sun or softer shadows, depending on the scene you are creating, maybe it's a cloudy day and these shadows are way too harsh, you can increase this value to have softer shadows. So the source angle right now is 0.5357. If you set it to 5, for example, you noticed our shadows kind of became softer, more transparent. But let me show you this area here, for example. So I will set this to its default value. As you can see, it starts harsh and then it gets softer and softer and softer. So if I increase this, it will become softer and softer. Increase it more, and so on. And if you look at the sun, thankfully we're looking on the computer, not real sun. So if you set this to a value of 15, it will increase the size. Just like in real life, when our light source is bigger, the shadows from that light source will be softer. So now if I set this back to 0, the source soft angle, this will affect how our lights will appear under reflections. So if I set this to 1, notice here the pool. If I set this to 2, 3, 4, and so on. This work on any light. If you want for your light to appear in specific reflections, whether it's a pool or a metallic or mirror-like object, we can change the source soft angle. So look here, and now let's set this back to 0, and now it's back to default. Now we have temperature. So if you enable this, increase the value, we will have a colder day, bluish, and if you decrease the value, we're gonna have a warmer day. Affects world and cast shadows, they do exactly what they say. So if you want to disable a light temporarily, you can do that from here instead of deleting that light. And if you want for a specific light not to cast shadows, we can do that from here. Obviously we need the sun to cast shadows, but maybe some other lights for performance considerations. You may add many lights just for their diffuse part, just to brighten our scene, but we don't want shadows. That's something we do because shadows can get really expensive when it comes to real-time rendering. We have 2 more settings. We have the indirect lighting intensity and the volumetric scattering intensity. Now, the indirect lighting intensity is also our global illumination. Notice areas that does not get light. They are looking decent, but let's say you want to brighten these areas or make them darker. Then if you want to make them darker, you can set this to a much lower value, not 0, but you know what I mean. 1 is the default value. Let's say for any reason you want for these areas to be brighter, and actually let me switch my post-process volume to manual so we can control what we see. So let's set this to 13, for example. Now look here and let's take a look at our directional light, and if I set this back to 0, we don't have much global illumination or indirect lighting going on. If you set it to 1, that's a default value. If you set it to 5, these areas now are brighter, as you can see. That's what it is. So I set this back to 1, and I will reduce my post-process volume to something like 10 for the outside. We don't want to hurt our eyes. And now let's go back to our directional light. And if you switch this value here, set it to 40, 50, whatever, nothing is happening. That's because we need to change a setting on our exponential height fog. So I will set this back to 1, and I will go to my exponential height fog, and I will scroll all the way down to volumetric fog. I will enable this, and this will allow us to have more photorealistic atmospheric effects. There is nothing changed as of now. Perhaps you can see this very minor change here. And depending on your scene and the values you are using, you will see the volumetric fog. So if I set this to 1, this is much more fog as of now. So let's set this back to its default value, and let's select our directional light. And just for the fun of it, let's set this to 50. And now we can see we have an interesting effect, the volumetric scattering intensity, how the light is scattering in the atmosphere. Now, I would say these are settings here for creative control, for your creative freedom, for your art direction. So now you know. Under advanced, you will find even more settings. Some of them will be discussed in future lessons, but for now, we will keep this as default. Under rendering, visible or not visible. So it's very similar to effects world, these two. And under light mass, these are for baked lighting, so we will not work with this now. And under light shafts, this is only for the directional light. This will give us cool atmospheric effects. So I will enable the light shaft occlusion and the light shaft bloom. And let me go to a place where we can have something like this. So notice this effect. So this is with and this is without. So we'll enable this again, the bloom. And let's enable the shaft occlusion, and you can see how they work in action. So if you want to create some cool God rays, you can do that from these two settings here. And they have more settings that you can play with. For now, I will set things back to default. Let's talk quickly about the skylight. So under skylight, if you click on it and let's go all the way to the top, you're gonna see we have an option called real-time capture. By default, not enabled now, but if you want to change the sun, you can see that the light is still blue. So right now it's not working in real time. So if you click on real time capture, you're gonna see that now this is closer to what's happening in real time. And if you disable this, when we enable this source type SLS captured scene, this will capture our scene and will apply our skylight in real time. So I will set this back here. I will set it to not capture our light in real time. And I will change this. And as you can see, this is much darker now. It's not capturing in real time. So if you enable this, and this is what you actually need to do if you want to use the skylight, it's important to have the most photorealistic scene. Now, I will disable this just for us, just for now, and let me show you something. Here under source type, we have two options. The scene capture, which is the default value, and we also have the option to choose a cube map or an HDRI. Now, select SLS specific cube map, click on here to select an HDRI, and you can download HDRIs from a website like HDRI Haven, import them in Unreal Engine, and then select the light. And you can actually light your entire scene just with a skylight if you want. So that's also pretty cool. The thing is, the more you use the lights, the more you will know when to use something and when not to use it. So it depends on your scenario, you can light your scene. So I will reset this to the default, and I will select real-time capture. And I will enable these lights by unhiding them. And here we are. The sky atmosphere, it also has settings. So by default, we have the ground radius. This is for Earth. Keep this as it is. If you're changing this to another planet, then you want to put the radius of that planet here. And you have other effects that you can art direct your sky. So you have the atmosphere height, the multi-scattering, the Rayleigh scattering scale, the atmosphere may. So these settings here, if you change them, you will have different effects that may be cool or maybe spooky now, but I highly recommend exploring these settings. Look at the documentation of Epic and you will build good understanding of the actors and their effects. This is especially cool when you're trying to simulate different weather effects. I leave links to everything in the description so you can read more. Now, you can also add clouds to your scene, and we can do that by simply searching for cloud. And here we have volumetric cloud. Right now I'm using Unreal 5.4. The clouds are not so perfect, but in Unreal Engine 5.5, the clouds are really amazing. So we will talk about 5.5 in the upcoming parts. However, for now, I will delete the clouds. So with these actors here, the directional light, the sky atmosphere, and the skylight, the exponential height fog, and a post-process volume, as I mentioned, this is everything you need for your base scene lighting. Interior, exterior, this is what you want. Now, if you don't want to place these manually, or if you want to get the exact location of the sun based on the latitude and longitude of an area, we need to use the sun position calculator. So let me get rid of this, except for the post-process volume, delete, and we can hide this just quickly. Let's go back to our lights. Let's go to sun and sky, click and add this. And right now it's pretty bright. Give it a few seconds to adjust the brightness. If you're using a post-process volume and you're using manual metering mode with manual exposure compensation, you may also want to change these to match the intensity of our directional light here. So I will show you what I did. First, let's just set this back to a lower value just to compensate for the exposure. Let's click on this actor, sun and sky, and you may have this. Or maybe, just like me here, you have this. Notice how this actor have the actors we just discussed. It has the sun, the directional light, there is the skylight, there is the sky atmosphere, there is the volumetric cloud, and there is the compass mesh to help us understand the east, north, south of our project. So this actor here, if you click on these individual actors, you can change their values from here, just like we did earlier. And if you want to change the location of the sun, so now I'm going to press Ctrl L and this is stuck. It does not move. The only way to move the sun with the sun and sky or sun position calculator is by simply clicking on the actor and setting the latitude, longitude, time zone. And in addition to this, you can also set the date to simulate where the sun will be exactly on this month, on this day. And in here, you can set the time, the solar time. So we can set it to 8 a.m. or midnight or back to 1 p.m. And now I hope you have better understanding of placing your base lights. Let's say you want to simply surround your project with an HDRI. You can do that from here. So click and drag. Let's add that HDRI. Still very dark. We need to compensate for the exposure. Well, it's also very dark because we don't have a light. But if I press F here, you're gonna see we have some sort of half sphere with nice edge, and if we go inside it, still black. So let's increase the intensity and let's select our post-process volume here. We can change the intensity from here again, and there we go. Now this might be a bug, but if your HDRI backdrop is very small, you will not see its effect on the geometry. All you need to do is to simply scale this up, and we can do that from the size. So I will increase the size, add few zeros, and now our HDRI backdrop is working as intended. So you can move it up, move it down. This is amazing for product visualization. You can place any product or any car or anything in the middle, and it will have really cool environment around it. If this is too stretched, you can change the projection center from here. So if I increase this value, we can change the projection. So maybe you want to do something like this and go to the interior and look at the nice exterior. That's very cool. So now I will delete this. And if you are using Cesium, just like I'm doing here, you will want to add the Cesium Sun and Sky. To add that, we can go to Window, click on Cesium, and let's unpin this so we can see what's happening here. And you can add the Cesium Sun and Sky. So add this. Let's fix the exposure again. And if you click on the Cesium Sun and Sky, you can see it has Cesium settings. We have the date and time, atmosphere, the sun, and settings regarding updating the sun and the atmosphere radius. And if you click here, you can see we have directional light, skylight, sky atmosphere, and a global anchor. This has to do with anchoring our actor in the real world, and we will talk about more Cesium advanced topics in the upcoming lessons. So if you want to change the latitude, the longitude, you can do that from here, but I don't do that from here. We usually do it from the Cesium georeference. When you change your settings from here, so sorry, well, I should reset this to the default. So don't do this mistake. What I did here, I messed up my scene. All right, so let me fix this and I will see you next where we're gonna talk about the other types of actors we have in Unreal to light our projects from the inside. All right, to continue working on the lighting of our project, let's go to Window, Cesium, and we can click on Cesium Sun and Sky. I will click on the directional light and I will set the intensity to what we had earlier, which is 10, so it will match our post-process volume. Now our sun is in the exact location where it should be in real world. I will also switch the name of global lights to just global. Keep this post-process volume here. Also add underscore and name it to global, and I will select the Cesium folder and I will place it here. If you want for this to be always on top, you can simply add an exclamation mark like so, and it will always be on top, or you can add numbers, it's up to you. Let's talk about the other light actors we have and keep moving forward. We have the point light, the spotlight, and the rectangular light. A point light is a point in space that will emit light in all directions. So when you add it, here we have a point, press G to toggle game mode, and the settings we have the intensity units. So right now it's using 8 candles, but you can switch this to lumens and to unitless. I'll keep this at candles. You can change the light color as well. So if you want to use green, here we are. We also have the attenuation radius. So I will right click just to move my camera and move a little back. You can see the radius here, and this is the area the light will reach. It's recommended to reduce this to just the area you want for the performance. So you should not add many lights and have them on default, especially when you're using rectangular lights and spotlights. This way, when you set the attenuation radius to the value you want and you make duplicates of your lights, by doing this, it will save you time when you are optimizing your project, and it will generally keep performance better. So I will delete the other light, and let's reduce the intensity here to something like 2, so it's not too bright. We also have source radius, and this will change the point in space to a sphere in space, and it will mainly affect the shadows. So right now, if you want softer shadows, we can increase this to 2 or 5 or 10. The more you increase it, the softer the shadows will get, and you're gonna see a presentation of that sphere here as well. So if I increase this to a much bigger value, now we have much softer shadows. The soft source radius, just like the directional light, when we change this, we will have our light appearing in the reflection. So I'm gonna switch this to 20, for example, and I will move it next to the window or the glass here. Here we can see our reflection of the light, and if I increase this even more, you can see how it's getting softer. So now you know. The source length, it will change this from a sphere to a line. So if you increase this, we have now this shape emitting our light. And this is useful if you want to have like hidden lighting under such places. So if I move this, and let's set this back to white color, and perhaps you can decrease the temperature so it's warmer. Now if you press on E to rotate, let's rotate 90 degrees, or you can set it from here, or you can enable the snapping for rotation for better rotation. And I press W and I can move this. If you hold Ctrl, left mouse button will move on the X axis. So I'm holding now Ctrl and click anywhere. It will move it on the X. Right mouse button, it will move it on the Y. And if you hold Ctrl and click on left and right mouse button at the same time, it will move it on the Z. So instead of moving your lights from their pivots, you can simply press Ctrl and place them manually, like so. This will be faster. And this is maybe too much, so we can set this to 3. And I highly recommend when you want to start placing your lights to isolate your selection. In this case, I can select this object while I have my light selected, and I can isolate my selection like so. Then go to the top view. I can switch to wireframe mode, and now it's so much easier to see what I'm working with. So I will click source length and increase this to a value I like, and here we are. So Ctrl H, that's my shortcut to hide or unhide things. So go to visibility, hide selected, show only selected, show all actors. You can set these to your liking from the editor preferences. Now let's reduce this even more, and the more time you spend placing your lights, the better your lighting will be. Very cool. And just like other lights, we have effects world, cast shadows, indirect lighting intensity, and volumetric scattering intensity. So many of these settings are shared between all the lights. So if we increase this to a massive value like 50, now we have much more indirect lighting coming from this light. This is maybe something you want, maybe something you don't want, it's up to you, but now you know. So I already set this to default. And let's move to the second light. The spotlight is just like the point light, but instead of emitting light in all directions, it's emitting light in shape of a cone. And the easiest way to place your lights in your scene is to click on your spotlights. So here, for example, I have placeholders, this group here, right click. If you have something like this in your project, a data math scene actor for your specific spotlights, you can press on select immediate children multiple times and it will select all the lights in your project. Now, when I have this, I click on my light and I isolate my selection again, then go to the top view. So hold Ctrl, middle mouse button, move your mouse up, and there we go. So click on the light and move it where it should be. Before you make duplicates of your lights, you definitely need to change some settings or place it exactly. Well, let's place it here, for example. And let's say the attenuation radius, so that's the main setting we want to change. Reduce it a little bit so it affects where it has to affect. And just like the point light, we have the exact same settings. The intensity units, attenuation radius, and other settings here. But here we have the inner cone angle, outer cone angle. These are the two main different settings from the point light, and the rest are the same. So the outer cone angle, if you increase this, we will have more bigger cone, and if you decrease it, we will gonna have something like this. And for the inner cone, let's just simply select these two objects so we can better see what's happening. For the inner cone, the default value is 0, but if you increase it, we're gonna have a brighter and brighter spot, and then the gradient or the fall off will be between the inner cone and the outer cone. So if you want a harsh fall off, you can keep these settings at the same. So 11, 11, this is now very harsh. And if you want more fall off, you can increase. So 11 to 15, as you can see here. For now, we can simply reset these to their default value, like so. Keep them as they are, it's okay. And now we're good. We can duplicate our lights, right? No, wrong. Before we do that, I highly recommend moving your light to a specific folder. If you don't have that folder, let's make that one. And let's say interior lighting. And we can make another folder here. And we can say lighting level 2. And let's say this is for this specific villa. So it's M22, just to make sure. Yep. And now we can move our lights. I also recommend adding the light name. So let's say this is the main area or the living room. Or you can add that here. And here you can have multiple folders. So let's say living room or main area or area A, whatever you want. Put this light here again. And every time we make a duplicate of that light, it will be within that folder. So when we want to add lights to the bedroom, we can make another folder, call it bedroom. And we can bring a duplicate like so, and move it here. And we can rename this to bedroom. And now we can place our lights if we have the meshes for these lights. So let's delete these and let's go back to where we were. Let's select our static meshes here, the spotlights, and let's select these two lights and let's quickly place them around. So I press Ctrl, middle mouse button to go to the top again and put this here and put this here. Click, drag, put here, there you go. And click again, hold Alt and drag, that will make a duplicate of your light. Notice when you create multiple duplicates, the default value on the light here, it seems to be stationary. When you are using baked lighting, these here, the mobility matters. But when you're using Lumen, it will just be dynamic light. So movable is similar to dynamic. Unreal Engine here is saying, hey, you're using stationary and you cannot have more than 4 stationary lights placed next to each other or overlapping like so. When you have more lights overlapping, more than 4, it will tell you, hey, just so you know, this light is movable. But as I said, because we're using Lumen, this really does not matter. you can either switch this to static or set them to movable. I like to keep them as static. They will always be movable, but it will be easier for me to bake the light if I want to bake the light, or just set them to movable. There is no right and wrong answer here when it comes to Lumen. So if you want the best solution, of course, or the right answer, you definitely want to use movable. But if you want to bake your lights later, then you need to select all your lights and set them to static. So now press Alt, click and drag, and that's how we duplicate our lights, like so. And if you hold Alt and now press Shift, the camera will move, like so, and place them here. Now let's go back to perspective view. Let's go to the interior. And as you can see, this is without and this is with. This is way too bright, but we can improve this as we go. And sometimes I like to place my lights like so, and then simply set the intensity to 0. And whenever I want to change something, I can simply right click, select all descendants and set the value I want. So that's one easy way to change intensities of your lights. Let's move to rectangular light. The rectangular light is going to emit light from the shape of a rectangle, exactly as it says. And you can use this as a hidden light or a light source from a surface and so on. It will also, because of the surface here, give us really nice soft shadows. As you can see here, it's beautiful. So just like other lights, we have the intensity units, the light color, the attenuation radius, and temperature, effects world, and these settings here. But what is different, we have the source width, height, the barn door angle, the length, and the source texture if you want to add a texture to your light, which is amazing. So the source width, change it. It will be wider or less wide. The height, we'll change the height. Door angle, since now we have a door, is set to 20. You can switch the angle if you want that specific effect. Imagine a softbox, for example, you can do that. Or you can disable the door length and your light now will emit the light in all directions from this 90-degree view. So if you don't want that, you can increase the door size and play with the angle from here. That's amazing. So let me show you how I could place this light here. Sometimes I like to press Ctrl X or Ctrl C on my light. And just like we pasted the furniture earlier with paste here, you can right click somewhere and go to edit and paste here. I have a shortcut for this, Shift V, so it will be easier for me to place my items when I want to copy them. Now I rotate this 90 degrees and then let's select this item here, then isolate my selection, go to the top view, press F to focus selection, place this light here, then let's change the width to something like 2, change the door to 1 or 2 so we can still have a door, and change the height to a different value. So let's say 270 units, that should be good, and move it on the y-axis like so. And once you're happy with the placement, you can move this to its specific folder like we're doing here. So let's save it here and go back. So click on it again. It will locate it in the word outliner for you. And here we are. Obviously, this is way too bright, so we can change the intensity to something much lower. And look at that. So if you want also to switch the temperature, you can do that. And if you want to add a texture, click here and you can select any texture and it will take the average color from that texture. Let's switch this back to its default value and let's select something more interesting or more visible. So let's say this yellow texture. Now we have yellow light. Click here to reset to the default and that's how it goes. Now, other thing I want to discuss is the ability to add IES profiles. So when you click on your light, let's say spotlight or even a rectangular light, you can scroll all the way down. You're gonna see something called light profiles. So I'm gonna click here because it's just easier to see. And here we have also IES texture. So if you click here, if you have nothing, you can click on this gear icon, show engine content, or you can import your own IES profiles. So now if I click and I select one of these profiles and then let's increase the intensity you can see the profile of that light. So let's set it to 2, for example. This is very bright, softer, and then more light. You can switch this to another light to see what's happening. So let's say this. Very cool. So you can use IES profiles as well. You can click here to use the IES light intensity, but make sure that you use the correct exposure so you know you have the real physical results of your light. For now, I will disable this and just use what I have here. We covered all the basics. Next, let's talk about the post-process volume. Let's talk about the post-process volume. So far, we have just one post-process volume and we named it global, and we want to add more. The reason you may want to add more if you have large project with multiple spaces, interior spaces, exterior spaces. So now if you go outside, it will adjust what we see. And if we go back inside to such a dark area, give it a few seconds to adjust. And now if you look outside, it will be very bright. Now this might be fine, but there are scenarios where you really need multiple post-process volumes. And there is a lot you can do with the post-process volume. It's not only the exposure, as you can see from here. So we have all these settings. Let's talk about them and let's make another. Before I make another, let's find our main post-process volume. So this is our global post-process volume. And let's place it in a place where we can see it. So I place it here, for example, and I'll make it duplicate like this. And I'll move this duplicate here. Let's make it bigger, like so, to cover our house. And if you want to double check, you can select the meshes where you want to place your post-process volume. So usually I select the exterior bounds and I isolate my selection and then go to a top view or something, then press F to focus my selection and adjust my post-process volume accordingly. Once you're happy with the placement from all sides, so we can go left, right, to place them exactly where they should be. And let's say now we are happy. What you need to do is to disable infinite extent and bound on the new post-process volume. And let's place our post-process volume where it should be under the project, or we can keep it here next to this guy. So here I will simply name it to something that I know is related for this project or that project. There are scenarios where we had post-process volumes for different rooms and so on. So naming your assets and actors is very important. Now, this is not infinite. This is good. Now, what we can do is changing some settings. So if you go to lens, let's say the exposure. So this is here, normal exposure. Let's say for the interior, we want manual exposure. So I'm gonna set this to manual. And now if you go inside, it will basically work. If you set this to specific value, so let's say 13 or 14, we're fine. And if we leave, it will not be as good as we expect because we need to set some settings. The first setting we want to check as well on our other post-process volume is also to set it to manual. And let's say this is like 12 or 10. And now this here, when we go inside, it should be brighter. Now, this is weird. It did not work. Why is that? That's because this one was not supposed to work from the first place. We were just lucky. What you need to do is to go all the way down to the post-process volume settings, and under here, the priority, you can have multiple post-process volumes and multiple priorities. So if I select the priority here and set this to 1, this post-process volume has a higher priority than this one. Therefore, this one will be prioritized on top of this one. It's that simple. You just add another post-process volume and you change the priority. So if you go outside, it's fixed. And if you go inside, we should be good. Let's say this is way too large, what we have here. So we can simply reduce the size of that and match it to where you want. So let's say I want it to start only when I go closer to the glass here or to the balcony. So we can change this, move it, and that's how it is. That's how it works. So if you add another post-process volume, so let's say the area here or any other area, you can do that. So let's do a duplicate and let's make it much smaller so we can see what's happening. Bring it next to us. Increase the priority to something like 2. And right now they both share the exact same settings. in terms of the exposure, but let's say we want the exposure here to be higher. So we can now go to where we have the exposure compensation and set it to a higher value. This way, you don't need to wait for the exposure to fix. It's just much faster if you want for that to be in your experience. Now, obviously, this is extreme value here. Let's set it to 16. And notice now it's kind of nice. It helps. Once we place our lights and everything, we will adjust our volumes, but that's how it works. So more post-process volumes, they all will have different priorities. You can also play with the blend radius and blend weight because you can blend these post-process volumes. And let's take a look at some other settings. Let's start with the lens and the bloom. Let's go to global and let's go to the bloom. Right now it's using standard. And if you want another type of bloom, there is this called convolution. It will change the bloom to this. And you can still play with the intensity, increase it or decrease it. You can play with the threshold and other settings. You can put a texture. So all these things you can do. Next to that, we have the exposure. So from here, we set the exposure to, let's say, manual, the exposure compensation. We also have chromatic aberration. This will split the image RGB channels and will make them distant from each other. So we have this effect. You may want this. We also have the ability to add a dirt mask. And I remember this from Battlefield 3. So many people used to hate it. Some people like it. You can use an alpha image to get such effect when you're looking at the sun or something. So it's there for you. So all these post-process volume settings are to improve the visual quality of your image. Under camera, you can change the shutter speed, the ISO, the aperture. So this is important for depth of field or motion blur. Lens flare, this is important. So right now it's disabled, but if you increase this, this is the lens flare. Maybe you want to keep it a little bit. You can put it to 0.1 or 0.05, and maybe you can increase the bokeh size like so. So that's a cool effect if you want it. We have image effects. So the vignette intensity, here you can see some darkness. If you set this to 0, now there is no vignetting. So just like cameras in real world, we can simulate this effect, the vignette and others. So let's set this back to 0.4 and let's keep going. Depth of field will allow you to have depth of field. Now I like to use the depth of field within my camera, but if you want for this to be a post-process effect, you can do that from here. Now let's exaggerate the feeling here by increasing these numbers. So here we have the focal distance. Maybe you can increase it even more. So let's say 300. And now if I go to an object here, we can see, yep, this is within 300 units. This is not so realistic, but it looks cool if you want to take some quick screenshots without using a camera. So let's reset these to their default value and we can turn them off. Now, let's close the lens. You will notice the post-process volume, they are divided into groups. We have the lens, we have the color grading, film, and so on. So color grading, it does what it says. It will color grade our shots. So we can start from the temperature. So right now, this is using white balance. So if we change this to something like 4,500, it will become colder. But if you switch this to color temperature, it will work in the opposite way. So maybe you want to do that, set this to 6,500, or if you want the inverse, you can select the white balance, just like our cameras. We can also tint our image to cyan here or to greenish. You can do that from here. So global, shadows, midtones, and highlights, these are also related for our color grading. With Unreal Engine 5.5, we can have a special panel for the color grading. Perhaps I'll cover that in the future. But now, if you enable the saturation, for example, on the global, you can change the saturation of your project globally. If you want to change the saturation on areas that are shadowy, we can go to shadows. So the contrast might be more visible under the shadows, and we can see all the areas that are receiving shadows. Now we can change their contrast. So here, the shadows, the more you change this, whatever setting you want, you can do that from here. You can reset this to the default, and same goes for midtones and highlights. Highlights, let's try the gamma, and any area that is really bright, we can switch its highlights. Just like so. You can achieve so many cool effects with the color grading here. And for now, we will leave this to the cinematics. Let's keep moving forward. Film, we have slope, toe, shoulder. So these are also settings you might be familiar with if you work in cinematography and color grading. I usually keep these as they are. So again, let's keep these for the cinematic section. Global illumination. Now this is important. We have Lumen, global illumination, and from here we can improve the quality of our scene or decrease it if you want. We have Lumen, scene detail. If you set this to 0, you're gonna see worse quality in general. So let's go inside perhaps. Let's go here and let's select our other post-process volume. So let's delete this and let's select this and let's set the Lumen scene detail to 0. It will not set to 0, it will be 0.25. That's the lowest it can. You can see these noises here. If you increase this to 4, let's say, we get better results, or areas that were completely dark, like here, they are now better. We can better visualize what's happening by going to the view modes. So we have under here, we have something that has to do with Lumen, and let's click on overview. Here you can see exactly what is Unreal Engine is seeing. So set this back to the default values and you will see some areas will become yellow, some areas will become pink. So here it says pink, missing surface cache. It will not look right in the reflections, or it won't work as perfect as it's supposed to do. And I will switch here, increase the settings, and you can see some of the yellow parts are gone and they will work better. Now the text here is not supported. There are this massive big mesh. If you want to fix this, then we need to separate it into smaller parts and the yellow will be gone from here. And by separate parts, we should not have a mesh like this. You can have this part alone, this part alone, this part alone. If this still persists, then you can divide just this part, then just this part, and so on. So this is very helpful when you want to visualize your projects. Let's select the post-process volume again. The final gather quality here, if you increase it, we will get better final gather quality. And if you decrease it, you will get worse. I don't know if you can see it, but when I set this to the lowest value, some areas here, they all became black. And if I increase this again, they have better quality. You can override some settings. So notice when I click and drag, it goes between 0.25 to 2. But if you want even higher quality, you can override this with 4 or 5, but don't go too extreme. If you scroll down more, you have advanced, we have how fast Lumen will update, diffuse color boost. So if I increase this to 5, we will have more diffuse color, which is too much. Well, not 5, 4 is the highest. If you set this to the lowest value or the default value 1, things will go back to normal. Skylight leaking, if you increase this to some value, you can see how the skylight is leaking within our apartment here. Maybe you want that. If you want to learn about any of these settings, you can simply hover your mouse and read the description. Let's keep going. Under reflections, we have the same settings we saw earlier in the project settings. So we are now using Lumen reflections. If you don't want to use reflections, you can set it to none. Or if you want to use screen space, you can set it to screen space. Ideally, you would leave this at Lumen. We will talk about all these settings more once we get into the rendering settings, if we need to change anything. These settings will be different from a project to project. So the best thing you can do is to experiment with these settings and look at the performance just in case. So if you click here, go to show FPS, you might increase some settings and they might reduce the performance or increase the performance. If nothing changed, maybe you will see the performance changing. So that will give you an idea about what's happening. That's good to keep in mind. Under reflections, we have the rendering features. You can go to post-process materials, for example, and add or create your own materials for post-processing. So I will add asset reference and let's search for any of my post-process materials. Let's say I have something that has to do with pixelation or scanning. So this glitch pixelation, give it a few seconds to load. Let's keep going. We have film grain. If you want to have some grain on top of your scene. I am over exaggerating these values just so we can see in the recording. And yeah, this is cool. So I will leave exploring all of these for you. Now, the final setting we want to take a look at is the path tracing. So if you have hardware ray tracing enabled and everything, and you want to get a ground truth image on how things should look exactly if we are using an offline rendering engine, you can actually do that in Unreal. So you need to go to let, and here you can To see that, you can go to Let and you can enable path tracing. Give it a few seconds. Now this will compile some shaders and whatnot. And now we will get the highest quality possible image from the engine because this will take its time to render. Let's say you want less rendering times, you can do that from here. So right now it's using 2000 samples. You can enable this and set it, let's say 200 samples. It will go much faster and then the denoiser will do its job. So let's give this a second. And after a couple of settings, this is the image we have and this is path traced. The moment you move your mouse, we're gonna lose this. So move your mouse and yep, it's lost. This will be helpful when you're trying to simulate the path tracing light with Lumen. Sometimes I switch to path tracing, see how things look after the image is rendered, and then I would adjust my lights to reach this image as close as possible. That's almost everything you need to know about the basics of the post-process volume. What you have to do is to go through all these settings, change them, and see how they affect your scene. Most of the settings here under path tracing, so brush settings, replication, all these, you will see them across many actors. You don't need to mess with them. So go from the post-process volume settings and up. And that's the same for any actor you are experimenting with or learning about. In the upcoming lessons, we will take all the knowledge we learned and just put it all together. Alright, I hope you enjoyed today's lesson and I will see you in the next one. Take care.